And we have my dear friend Ian joining us right now. He is the agency director of Bell Curve, and I'm going to let him take it from here to lead y'all through the content-led growth with Amanda and Jimmy.
Hey everyone, I'm very excited to be here and very excited to get this opportunity to chat with both Amanda and Jimmy. To get things kicked off, I'll do a little bit of an intro and then we'll get right into it. So Amanda Natividad is the VP of Marketing for audience research startup Spark Toro. She's also a contributor for Adweek and a Cordon Bleu-trained chef, formerly a journalist as well. Amanda previously led marketing for Growth Machine and Liftopia, and she built Fitbit's B2B content program. So a lot of different things that you've been working on. Thank you so much for coming in and speaking with us today. And we also have Jimmy Daly here, who is the co-founder of Superpath, a community and job board for content marketers. He's previously the VP of growth at Animalz, which is an agency, and currently lives in Vail, Colorado with his wife, daughter, and chocolate lab. Thanks for being with us, Jimmy.
Yeah, thank you.
Today, I got a bunch of questions on all things content-led growth, but I'd love to maybe perhaps get both of your perspectives or POVs on like what is content as opposed to other marketing initiatives, right? How would you define content in your own words? So maybe Amanda, can we start with you? Like, how do you define content?
Yeah. So I mean, content is, it is everything to me. I guess I would say that content is any kind of produced piece or program that encompasses your brand messaging and your value proposition. Maybe that's the broadest way to say it, but maybe I would pause there.
All right, Jimmy, how would you define content?
I think the way I think about it is that like there's certain type of companies who have just this kind of spirit of education and community baked into their company values. And I feel like content is the output of that, more so than other marketing channels. Obviously, other channels are useful in their own ways, but I feel like it's for companies who really want to connect with people in ways beyond just the transactional nature of business. Like to me, that's what content really is.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think those are both great definitions. I know I come from the advertising world, and I would often get into lengthy debates on is it advertising, is it content? Like, what's the difference? Where's the line blur? Because sometimes it can get a little gray in that space. But it's great. I'd love to move on from that and see, content has come a long way. A lot of things have changed about content and how you use content to market your business, and a lot of things have kind of remained the same. As we go into the new year, we're in Q4 now, we're heading into 2023. What are some ways in which you've seen content change over the past year or two? And maybe we can start off with Amanda if you want to get started.
Yeah. So I think in the recent couple years, I think we're finally starting to break out of this classic notion that content marketing means owning a blog and SEO strategy. And I think more and more teams or more startups are becoming aware that modern content marketing or content marketing today is often much more than that. So I think today it's not uncommon for content marketers to also own the podcast, a newsletter, YouTube channel, social media, or more than that. So that's how I feel like we've seen content shifting in the recent years. And, with the rise of all these new and different content formats, I really feel like now is the best time to be a content marketer.
I would definitely agree with that. Yeah, I would echo everything Amanda said. I mean, the way that I sort of keep track of this type of stuff is by monitoring the conversations that are happening in our community. And there's a lot more conversation over the past year about audio, video, PR, communications. Just like any opportunity for the business to communicate with the customer is in one way or another probably getting dumped on the content marketer's desk. Sometimes for better, maybe sometimes for worse too, like not all of us are equipped with the right skills to do that. But I feel like that's a huge opportunity for content marketers at the moment is to develop skills outside of just writing, right? Because it's essentially the same thing, right? You have to learn the new mediums, learn the new tooling, and all that type of thing. I would say also we're seeing companies get a little more creative with things like user-generated content or data-generated content. You know, I feel like while there's still quite a bit of like this kind of the same old, like, do your keyword research, pick a keyword, write 2,000 more, you know, and that actually can still work. Like we still see that working a lot. Like a lot of teams are also kind of broadening their horizons a little bit and trying to find higher leverage ways to create content. I feel like UGC and data are kind of like right at the core of that. There's other ways too, but yeah, just in general, like more creativity, more variety. It's cool. It's a good time in content for sure, like Amanda said.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to double click on that, the idea of like expanding skills and content evolving, you know, not just being maybe copywriting and it's, you know, starting to encompass audio and video. It's almost as if, you know, the job that maybe one person was doing in a company now needs to be quite a few people, you know, ideally. How have you seen how have teams been kind of scaling out in content, and what types of new skills or new team compositions have you been seeing as we move into this world?
I feel like Jimmy would know this better since he's, you know, talking with a group or a community of content marketers every day. So I would love to hear Jimmy go first.
Yeah, sure. The biggest thing we've seen is that it seems like most companies, and most of the companies that we're talking with are B2B SaaS. So just putting that out there because it's not the same across all industries, but all teams seem to hit this point at some point in their company life cycle where content has traditionally been a growth mechanism, and then more is asked of the content team, and they sort of hit this point where they have to decide, like, does content become this internal agency to serve other parts of the business? Should we keep the content team focused exclusively on growth? You know, do we need a writer on the product marketing team, or the product marketing team have their own writing? Do we need a writer over here on the partner marketing team? Or should we have like a matrix thing where, you know, the content folks are all centralized and there's this pool of resources to dip into? Every company ends up coming up with their own version of that and what works for them. But we find that that's like it's a big challenge. Like a lot of companies are struggling to figure out what that looks like as content becomes not just this one kind of siloed off part of the business, but this kind of layer that ends up being important for lots of different departments. You know, there's no like clean answer to exactly how that works. Like I can think of some companies who have like leaned heavily into the internal agency model and it works really well for them. You know, I can think of other companies who have eschewed that in favor of keeping a small, lean group of content marketers focused exclusively on like the traditional content KPIs, like, you know, page views, organic traffic, email subscribers, things like that. So, you know, ultimately, I think it boils down to how, you know, the business case for it. Also just sometimes the company's appetite for content, right? Like some companies, like it's very important to them. Like I said, it's like part of their ethos. And they want content marketers like across the company. In other cases, it doesn't make sense. So, you know, I sort of hate to say it depends, but it does. It depends on a lot of things. And there's a couple different setups that we see working pretty well.
Yeah, I think I want to add to that. Like, I feel like I've been seeing a lot of freelancers or agencies take on more of the content at other companies, and maybe something I'm not seeing as much, or I still think there's a big opportunity for content marketers specifically, is kind of leveling up to that really like next level true like content marketing director, where instead of being the one who's just running a blog, it's being the person who quarterbacks like all the blog content, turning that into a new content program, or running a different content program that becomes like one of the defining content pieces for the company, if that makes sense. So I guess what I'm trying to say too is I think there's still a big opportunity for content marketers to bring new types of expertise to the table, like maybe more like specific expertise in podcasting specifically, or more expertise in video production and YouTube. I think that's where we're kind of going next, or we've kind of been going with content, right? Like going to all these different kinds of formats. So I think now there's going to be a need for people who are really, really good at hosting and growing a podcast, for instance.
That's
That's
interesting.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, no, Amanda said something that I just wanted to follow up on briefly. It's this question of, at least for content marketers still focused exclusively on text-based content, is who writes it? And Amanda's totally right. Like, in-house teams are creating less and less content, and they're outsourcing or partnering up with vendors, agencies, contractors, whatever, to do more and more of that, which means the skill set for the in-house person is evolving, right? I would say there too, it's sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Like, a lot of people get into content marketing because they enjoy the craft of writing, and they hit this point in a career where they have to decide, am I going to lean into this kind of like high level individual contributor role? Maybe that means I'll ultimately end up going freelance, or am I going to develop some of these like quote unquote softer skills that make me valuable to the organization, like vendor management, which is not something that's talked about a lot, but is really important if you're overseeing agencies and freelancers who are doing the work for you. Luckily, there's a lot of options these days. You know, that's one thing that's happening with the variety of this. Like, more people than ever are working in a freelance capacity. Like, gosh, we see that just people are in droves heading towards freelance work, at least in our Slack community. And I think that's awesome. Like, there's just like an awesome career to be made there if the skill you want to lean heavily into is primarily the writing part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As more and more content is required, the platforms and the mediums for which you're producing content continue to expand and evolve. Content has kind of gone from perhaps a tactic that used to be seen as fairly, maybe low cost, high effort, into one that is probably a little bit more costly now, whether that's in staffing or agencies or freelancers. And if you're an earlier stage, startup, you obviously have to kind of pick and choose your battles on, like, what am I going to invest in? How am I going to find traction? Should I go paid? Should I go content? So I'm curious, for the earlier stage companies that are just kind of getting the product into market, how should they be thinking about content, and whether that's the right channel for them to lean into or not, and maybe what signals they should be looking for, whether that's going to be the one for them?
For various kinds of startups, for
early stage startups, either B2B or B2C, you can take your end.
I do kind of feel like, I feel like it's such a boring answer, but I do still feel like there's a big advantage to having the company blog, like, because once you're producing all this content at scale, it just kind of goes back to, like, well, where are you going to put it? Like, you should put it on the blog. So I still think that's important to have. But something else I think is also really important is really growing those rented channels, those rented top of funnel channels like social media, and getting really good at those. And maybe even starting there, right? Like, something I want to talk about is the notion of zero-click content, right? Zero-click content is content that has standalone value, where clicking to read more or learn more or to view it is only additive to the experience, not required. And in creating zero-click content, it's a way to essentially optimize the content native to any given platform. So I think more startups, more companies, more people should really be thinking about that and optimizing to get seen on these top of funnel channels. And then, eventually, building the road that goes to your owned house, to your blog, or whatever that might be.
For anyone who's not familiar with the term and the concept of zero-click content, could you explain that for the audience?
Yeah. So zero-click content it's a phrase I coined, really largely based on how I've been seeing the trends in social media or top of funnel content, where I've been seeing that the people who are growing their audiences fastest, who are gaining the most traction, are people who are creating this content that has standalone value to each platform. So examples of that would be like Twitter threads, right? You have people like Sahil Bloom, who pretty much exclusively wrote threads for like 2 years before he ever even launched a newsletter. Like, I think he's one of the first people to really treat Twitter like a blog, right? So that's one example. writing LinkedIn posts, like 100-word LinkedIn posts, where they're kind of like mini blog posts that have all the value right then and there. Readers don't need to click to leave. But ideally, at some point, you will be able to, or you will direct readers or users somewhere else. But at that point, clicking on it for them is only additive to their experience, you know? So it's not so much, hey, look at a cool blog post, here's the link. It's, here's a summary of my blog post in 100 words. By the way, if you want to read more about this or get the full context, go to my blog.
Anything to add there, Jimmy?
No, well, I was just say that's super interesting. I just feel like there's the thing that we talk about sometimes at Superpath that we phrase is like promotion is hard, distribution is easy. And the thinking there is kind of like what Amanda said, is like as you develop your channels, whether it's your email list, whether it's Twitter, LinkedIn, or whatever else, it becomes really easy to distribute content later on, you know, but you have to put in that upfront effort to get anyone to follow along, to subscribe or whatever, and just do exactly what Amanda just said. I think that will work really well. And then on the thought of just like early stage content strategy, I feel like for really early stage companies, probably don't hire a content marketer, you know, like particularly if you're going to be product led, your first hire should either be like a really strong generalist marketer or maybe a product marketer. Get them access to the blog and just let them write all about the product, you know, like make sure that people really understand what it is, what are the use cases, talk about integrations, talk about, you know, if you can get customer stories going, like stay really close to the product and ideally really close to the money also. Maybe that's slightly different if you're early stage, but you're enterprise SaaS and you've like building out a sales team. Like in that case, maybe you do have a content person dedicated to just supporting a sales team through case studies, customer stories, and, you know, helping them with building email campaigns or whatever other like sales enablement stuff that they need. But across the board, I think that one thing that basically any early stage company can still do and still be really effective is just to take people on the journey of getting the company and the product off the ground. It's like the easiest kind of like most obvious thing. I would loosely call it meta content, you know, just be like, you know, we raised our round, like, here's how we did it, you know, or like we launched this new feature. Here's the story behind how we came to it and the struggles that we kind of went through to get it to market. Or, you know, we put together our first company retreat and here's the things we learned, like stuff that's really tangentially related to the product itself. But, you know, basically anyone in business or marketing is generally attracted to that type of thing where it's, you know, written in the first person, you know, it's casual, it's informal, and you're sort of taking people along the journey as opposed to just saying, you know, kind of putting out more traditional marketing messages about like, you know, this feature does X, sign up here, you know. It's just, I think it's just a nice way to like kind of showcase some of the people and the story along with the business. And not everybody has the appetite for it, but I still feel like, you know, some companies going back along like Buffers, like kind of the classic example of this, but plenty of companies have done this type of thing extremely well. And I think it could still work.
Yeah. I think, you know, adding on to that, I feel like early stage startups would benefit greatly to reframe how they think about content. Like, rather than thinking about it as, you know, SEO or like having a blog. And, you know, I think SEO is a means to an end, but I think reframing it to taking a jobs to be done approach to content. So the idea of, you know, what job can your content accomplish? And so it's like what Jimmy said, you know, just now, like maybe content kind of fulfills the need for sales. And so in that case, you know, sales enablement content, case studies, you know, battle sheets, whatever it is that sales teams need, that's sort of the job to be done for content there. Or it could fulfill the need for product marketing, right? If you wanted to create, what am I saying? If you wanted to take more of a product-led content approach, you know, then the job to be done for content is growing the product or growing the business. So I think thinking more about that and then using the kind of classic KPIs of like SEO, the search rank, you know, page views, using that as like, sure, that's the means to an end, but ultimately the goal is for content to accomplish a job for you.
How might an in-house content marketer facilitate that conversation and kind of start stepping out of their lane, right? Like, let's say you were kind of in this very specific copywriting, SEO, more traditional type content role, but you want to apply this job to be done framework, and you want to include more people in the org and kind of start to step outside of your lane. What might be a path towards that? What type of conversations or questions could you be asking your team members to open up that door to let you start kind of expanding that skill set and stepping out of your lane?
I
I can
think
kick that one off.
being
Oh no, go
yeah,
ahead.
go
Sorry,
ahead.
Amanda, go ahead.
Yeah. No, you
Oh,
should.
what? Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I mean, to me, that sounds like managing up, like that's a soft skill that people develop kind of throughout their career, but trying to communicate to your boss or your boss's boss or whatever, the things you're seeing on the ground with your like very hands-on subject matter expertise, like oftentimes is much more like on the money than what someone kind of far above you is wanting to happen from like a top-down perspective. I feel like usually that conversation, well, two things. One is that luckily a lot fewer companies are so concerned about page views these days, which is great because it just opens up the door to a much more nuanced conversation about how content can support the business. Whereas like even 5 years ago, it's like, okay, we need 100,000 page views. 2% of people are going to sign up for trials. 5% of those are going to become long-term customers. So it's just pump more in there. I feel like when it comes to managing up, talking about data is often the best way to do it. And so honing in on whatever the most relevant key metrics for your business are. Like for a lot of companies, it's MQLs. And so if the content team ends up being responsible for MQLs as opposed to page views, like they can orient an entire strategy around that's going to look a lot different than the kind of keywords that turn into ultimate guides to whatever type strategy. There's obviously like a lot that comes along with that. Like one thing that we encourage basically all content marketers to develop are really strong Excel or Google Sheet skills so that they can so they can tell their own stories with data and they can come to their own conclusions, and then they can use that to present to somebody else as opposed to kind of waiting around for someone else to get you the data dump and you ask them the questions and they actually go in there and do it. Like that like really puts you in a position of like very, very low leverage. So like as you're thinking about managing up and trying to like kind of direct the content or even the marketing strategy in a direction that you feel would be better for the company, like one, you have to be able to communicate that to your manager, which I said is like a whole thing in itself. But two, like being able to wrangle your own data to tell that story, I think is really super important.
Mm-hmm.
I think
yeah, go ahead.
in expanding their role internally, I think there's the biggest opportunity for content marketers to learn to create product-led content. I think that's the biggest opportunity in most companies or most teams. I say that because I think that's sort of the most economical or efficient way to get ROI from your content. And it also requires working with other stakeholders, like product marketers, maybe the product team, maybe the sales team, right? Depending on what kind of organization you have. And it gives you more opportunity to manage up and out or manage laterally. And I think it's also a way to reframe your thinking about content and making it immediately useful or actionable to the business. So I think I should get more specific. That's a little bit abstract still. I think thinking about content, the product-led opportunities in content, like things that could even go beyond quizzes and calculators, but that's part of it. Where I feel like quizzes and calculators are still in that realm of what, like, it isn't always owned by content marketing. Sometimes it's owned by product marketing. But those tend to be the types of assets that that have viral loops, right? That they generate people repeat visits, get people to share them up and out, or get users to share them with their friends or whatnot. And ultimately is a healthier way to create content.
Mm-hmm. On the topic of metrics, you mentioned, learn how to use your spreadsheets and all that. What are some of the metrics that you're looking at to kind of tell that data story, right? What are some of the KPIs that you think are important for content marketers to be paying attention to? And in the context of growth in particular, like how can you use data? What types of metrics can you be looking at to prove that you're having an impact on growth?
I feel like there's a lot there. Well, I guess the simplest way that this is what we do at Superpath. This is what I would recommend to the companies that we work with, is boil it down to like 3 or 4 numbers. There's so many numbers that potentially lead you in a bunch of different directions. So we try to keep it really, really simple. So like numbers I would recommend be like MQLs, and you have to define internally exactly what an MQL means to you, because I've learned in sort of having conversations with people that it means slightly different things to different people. So defining that, keeping track of that, probably also organic traffic growth, but I would recommend tracking it month over month. So the percentage growth per month is really what you're interested in, as opposed to just the absolute number. Like in my time at Animalz content agency, just as an example, we had a lot of customers who would say things like, we want to double our organic traffic, or we want to get to 100,000 organic visitors, whatever, these kind of like big, lofty, like milestone type goals. And we just found that once they understood like what it took to get there and what it would cost and how long it would take, they would lose their appetite for it relatively quickly. But if you can say, okay, we're going to try to improve your monthly organic visitors by 10% month over month. And if we do that for 24 months, here's what your traffic looks like. And then they go, wow, that's amazing if we could do that, but it's like focusing on the small thing that we can monitor closely. We feel that there's a very strong signal there that if we do this, that it will have the right trickle down effects for the rest of the business. So MQLs and organic growth, I feel like those are like if I have to boil it down to 2, and I actually think it'd be better to have 2 rather than a dozen, those are the 2 I would go with.
Yeah. I mean, I agree, but I also, that's not really what we track at Sparktoro, right? So, I mean, yeah. So I think the way we look at content at Sparktoro is it depends on what job the piece of content is serving. So in the case of like earlier this year, we came out with an original report on the amount of fake followers on Twitter. So we conducted our own analysis, gave a definition for what constitutes a fake follower, like fake follower, spam, or inactive account. And I think it was Twitter who said they estimated like less than 5% of users are fake or spam. And we found that it was more like 20%. And this was research that we pulled together pretty quickly. I think it only took about 4 days. But the goal of this was essentially digital PR. Like we were sort of, trend jacking, right? Elon Musk was in the news about over his bid for Twitter. And so everyone is talking about fake followers. And Elon even cited our research. I don't think he cited our names, but he cited our research and some of the press that he did. But that wasn't necessarily a KPI. But what we were looking out for was if it would get picked up by media. And so that was something that we actually got over 500 unique press mentions. And something that's kind of cool is before we came out with this research, we didn't rank at all for the term audience research. We say that our tool helps you do audience research. We say we're an audience research startup. We weren't ranking at all for it. But after this report came out, we started ranking number 2 or number 3. Sometimes we rank number 1. So that's sort of like, depending on what the content is, we look at stuff like that. Other things we look at are if the job of the content is to promote a webinar or gain webinar registrants, then we look at that, right? We look at how many people did we get signing up for this webinar? How many relative to last time, or how many relative to when we didn't create a blog post in advance of it? So changes each time, but we're finding different ways to gauge success, resonance, and reach of our content.
When you're creating content, there's a lot of ways to approach the strategy behind it, right? And earlier on, it might be a little clearer, right? Like maybe you have some specific keywords you're trying to rank for or what have you. But as things, time progresses, thinking about what content should I be creating requires some thinking, requires some strategy. How do you approach thinking about like strategy, coming up with like content pillars? Like how do you approach strategy? And again, in the context of like an earlier stage startup that's maybe made it past that core bit of content and is looking to expand, what are some questions they should be asking themselves, to think through that strategy?
I personally like to think of content strategy, whether it's early stage or later stage, as using lanes, like a lane meaning like a certain type of content created for a very specific purpose. And then the combination of those lanes drives the whole strategy forward. So like an early stage company might do like one lane might be thought leadership, maybe another lane is sales enablement, and then a third lane might be SEO, like with the thought that like we're going to start building this foundation, but it's not really going to pay off for 6, 12, 18 months or whatever. I sort of like this though, because it just keeps it. It's possible that you get into it and you learn that one lane is really good, another lane is not. It's not working. You can swap it out without blowing up the whole strategy. It's like you always have a couple irons in the fire, and then you can kind of work backwards. Like as you figure out which your lanes are, you can kind of work backwards to figure out how to optimize each one, what distribution channels make the most sense, how are you going to reach people? Do you need to put a little paid spend behind it to get it rolling? Like are there specialized vendors that can help you execute each one? How do you measure them? Can you boil it all down into a single spreadsheet with a couple numbers, or do you have to try to attribute each lane to different business outcomes? But yeah, I mean, we've seen that work with like super early stage, really like late stage, like large enterprise SaaS companies, even direct to consumer, which is kind of like its whole own world of stuff. But I'm a big fan of this kind of like portfolio approach where you get a couple things going at any given time.
Yeah, I really like that. Another way I think about it too is figuring out your short-term and your long-term goals with content. A short-term sort of goal that I often turn to is just looking at the sustainability of content. Like, can that piece of content sustain other parts of the business? So maybe it's like an SEO blog post. Maybe what it sustains is your ability to create an ebook in about a month that's derived from a set of similar types of blog posts. Or if it's a case study, right? And it becomes your short-term KPI is whether your sales team was able to use it in a client call or a prospect call. So thinking about things like that, and then the long-term thinking being, what does this program look like over time? Like, okay, we're publishing some blog posts, or we're publishing 2 weekly blog posts. What does the blog look like 6 months from today, or 12 months from today? Or if it's a podcast, same thing. Like what's the goal of that podcast, and what does success look like 6 months from now?
That's interesting. Actually, I have a question for you. Is like one thing that we see is that I feel like for the most part, companies can grab like boilerplate off the shelf content strategy, and if they just execute it well and do it long enough, like it's probably going to work, But I'd be curious, like in your, like you just have experience at so many different and really cool companies. If you get into situations where it becomes clear that a lane or a strategy is just not working anymore and has to be killed off, or at least like significantly overhauled. Like, have you come across that? And is that, like, have you had the experience of being like, we thought this thing was going to be awesome, it's not, we need to pivot for whatever reason?
Yeah. So I think, one thing that comes to mind, which is kind of a fun example, is at Liftopia, right? Liftopia was a ski lift ticket company. They were sort of like the Expedia of ski lift tickets. And when I had joined, the company was quite old. Like, it was the oldest startup. And they had a blog for a really long time. So great domain authority, great content, a lot of it. So the stage that I joined, it was like, there are only so many things you can say about the highest vertical drops in North America. Like we ranked #1 for that. It was awesome, but like what next? So the tricky thing was, well, what other keywords can we get? Like we did all the content, all the content's done. So I started to think about putting a more timely spin on content. So sort of trend jacking, right? And this worked pretty well, but it was also hit or miss. So we'd have several posts that just didn't gain any traction really, and then other posts that did really well. So one was the kind of trend jacking aspect, but the other thing we did was to sort of capitalize on our domain authority and being like the content leaders in the skiing space. We also took the approach, the sort of wire cutter approach of like doing product or gift guide recommendations, because my hypothesis, I guess, there was, well, everybody knows, or a lot of people already know Liftopia, and we have some brand equity here. Maybe it would work really well if we started kind of trying to capitalize on that reputation and creating content about that. So that worked well in that some of the gift guides that we did would get picked up by niche bloggers who'd be like, oh, this list is actually really good. So those are, I think, kind of two interesting examples, because you so rarely hear about what do content teams do when the level of their content or their stage of their content has matured so much.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's a great example. I think that's really interesting. I feel like you don't hear that too often. Like I can't think of any, like I always go back to like our community and just the conversations people are having there. And I don't know that topic has ever come up, that we like maxed it out. What's next? You know, that's really cool.
Yeah, thanks.
You know, particularly with like social media and everything, how do you think about like founders' brands and their content alongside the business's brand and its content? And how do you think about those two? When is, you know, should every, you know, founder have a personal brand alongside the business? Should they be kind of exploiting both of those opportunities? So there are times where maybe it doesn't make sense for you to focus on that. How do you think about that in your content strategy with the companies you work with?
I can think of a few ways that it plays out. You know, like I'm overgeneralizing, but I feel like there's a founder personality type that loves this kind of thing. They just have so many ideas. Like maybe they do some writing on their own, and at some point a ghostwriter maybe can come in and just like help them, like, you know, export their thoughts and package it up into content. And I think that can work really well. And then I think when it's forced, when somebody's like, you know, we need more executive thought leadership, like how do we do it? You know, like that just, I don't know, I've never seen that go over all that well. But I feel like in general, I feel like, well, there's kind of the founder-led content, which Dave Gerhardt wrote a book about this, which I've recently started reading, and it's really good. Like he just kind of lays out like his view on how this can work really well, and it's really good stuff. But I feel like it doesn't have to be just about the founder either. Like I think that one thing that happens on a lot of content teams is there's like the people who are creating the content may not even be getting bylines for the stuff that they're writing. And I think that it's kind of de-incentivizing for the content team, because a lot of these people aspire to be better known for their work. And content is somewhat unique in the sense that you can get public credit for the stuff that you do at your job, you know? So, I mean, to me, that's like one of the best things about it is that like, if your name and face is on a piece of work you're really proud of, like that's public, you know, your mom and dad can even see it, you know, let alone like other people in your industry. So I feel like sometimes it's a better idea. Like say your founder is not the founder who's just like spouting off ideas constantly. And like, you know, you almost have to rein them in. I think maybe a better opportunity is to empower the individuals on the content team or the freelancers that you have writing the stuff to have their faces and voices out there a little bit more. You know, sometimes even encouraging them to write in the first person, right? Instead of this kind of like dry, like SEO B2B thing that some companies, and certainly I've been part of teams that have been very guilty of that, right? Like it becomes so generic. But once you say like, it's your name, it's your face, it's your ideas, right in the first person, like the personality of the writer really comes out. And I think it's a really cool opportunity for the company as well to kind of brand some of the folks on their team as experts in the field and just give them the opportunity to speak.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting distinction, founder content versus brand content. I mean, I think founder content, it really needs to come from the founder, right? I mean, I think sure they can work with a ghostwriter, like I think that's fine, but I think we've all kind of worked with the executive who's like, we need thought leadership content. I need you to write it for me. That's never going to work. You've been there, right? So having a founder with a strong point of view on something and having them be comfortable talking about that point of view. Ways to do that would be like, if they want to do the writing themselves, or, you as a content marketer can interview them, sort of ghostwrite it on their behalf, but you also need to work really closely with them to make sure it really is their thoughts, right? It really is like an extension of their brand. In my case, working at SparkToro, I mean, I'm lucky to work with a founder who creates his own content, right? So I think the content, probably the best way to describe our content at SparkToro is that we do essentially founder content. And I say that for myself. I'm not a founder of the company, but the blog posts that I write are sort of from the founder perspective. Like it's from my perspective as a longtime marketer in the space and how I think about content or how I think about various marketing tactics. I really think this only works if the people themselves are willing to create it. So yeah.
Yeah, I feel like you hit on something really important, which is that like strong ideas are going to be way easier and more interesting to write about, but also the company, it depends on the company, of course. Like small company, it's easier. Large company, it's harder. The company has to be willing to just let people, they can't like de-risk the content to the point where it doesn't say anything anymore. That becomes really difficult at a certain scale, but also if you started early, it becomes part of the company culture too, to like empower people to say what they want to say. You know what I mean? Not in crazy things, but like have their own perspective on things. And that can scale really well, but probably needs to start early.
Totally. I think we should touch on the brand content piece. Like how do we differentiate brand content versus founder content or any other sort of thought leadership content? What comes to mind for me is during my time at Fitbit on the B2B side. So Fitbit B2B was selling devices in bulk to other employers so that they could run corporate wellness programs. We also sold separate software for this. And so a lot of the content we created, it wasn't really SEO content because it wasn't really the business need that we had at the time. A lot of our content was in this realm of founder or brand content that was about our point of views in this space. So the way we would approach it was the brand content was sort of, why do we, Fitbit B2B, deserve to be here? Like, why do we have a point of view on, type 2 diabetes management? And then the founder stuff was like, we had who did we have? We had like a medical director, or a chief medical officer who had his own content. And he was, he's an actual doctor. So his content was his. And so he would write about like, here's why I think, remote patient monitoring is the future of health. So that would be his point of view on that. And then maybe the supplemental piece that we would write as the brand would be, here are ways to do remote patient monitoring with other types of health devices. Some wonky examples there, but I hope this kind of helps kind of break down some of the distinction between when is something from the brand's point of view and when is something from a founder or executive's point of view.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've also I've done some thought leadership stuff for Superpath, but I publish it on a personal blog as opposed to the company blog because I just feel like, I don't know, it just feels different. Like I feel like I can say a little bit more. I feel like I can talk more about like my personal experience and like sometimes be really frank about like how crappy something went or how frustrated I was at this or that, I think there's probably like, I don't approach it in this way, but there is an opportunity to build backlinks back to your company domain. Like I've done some guest posts along the same lines where,
Mhm.
like I'll write a post for an external site to talk about like my personal experience doing something. And then we get links back to that. It's actually worked really well. I don't pursue that as like a proper strategy. It's just like when I feel like I want to say something, or I feel like I've sort of accumulated enough experience on a small topic that there's something worth writing about, I'll do it.
Mhm.
And I feel like I feel like maybe we don't see that as much as we used to. Like, I feel like it used to be that a lot of people kept personal blogs and they would kind of like write like alongside, like sort of in parallel. That probably is, like I said, you can't really like operationalize that strategy, but for like, if
Mhm.
you have a writer that really likes writing, like encouraging them just to do it in whatever way feels comfortable to them, probably going to have some positive side effects for the business also.
Yeah. Wait, Jimmy, how do you think about the distinction between writing on your personal site versus like for Superpath versus doing a guest post on someone else's website?
I feel like when I write for Superpath, which to be honest, I very rarely do, I'm thinking about like, who's the target reader, like what conversations have I observed in our community that potentially could like provide some examples or anecdotes that I could work into this piece, like what's the takeaway I want people to have. There's like a strong marketing focus on it versus if I write on my personal site. Like I wrote a post not that long ago, like it was kind of about Superpath, but it was about this conversation I had with my wife who like helped me like get to this realization of just sort of like a negative mindset that I was stuck in, and how she sort of helped me like work through that. Like I probably wouldn't write that for the company blog. I could, I guess, but something about it just feels different. And then for guest posts, I actually don't write about content marketing at all. I write about community building, which is
Mm.
something I've spent 2.5 years now thinking about like almost constantly, but is not exactly the right fit for the folks we're reaching at Superpath, who are primarily content marketers, and maybe they're kind of involved in community at their own company. But I like it because it gives me an outlet to just sort of like kind of document some of the stuff that I've learned in getting into the whole community world.
As the skills required have evolved for content marketers, one of the ones that you touched on was vendor management, right? So whether that's agencies, freelancers, whatever, you need to get into a place where you're probably writing a lot more briefs. And I've seen a lot of briefs in my time, and I'm sure you both have, and there's been some great ones, and there's been some terrible ones, and there's been some that aren't exactly brief. They're more like, 30-page documents with everything under the sun. And so I'd love to get both of your POVs on like how to craft a good brief, like what are the essential bits in there, if you want to get, the most out of whoever it is you're working with.
Oh gosh, I haven't written a brief in quite a while.
Yeah.
I try to keep it short-ish, like 2 pages or less. If I can fit it on 1 page, even better. But I think depending on what it is, right? Like if it's a brief like for a freelance writer versus like video production agency or that sort of thing, I think I would try to. I normally write out like what the program's goal is. Like the program meaning like, let's say it's a creative brief for a freelance writer, then the program goal is the blog's goal, but the individual post might have its own goal. So I try to create a distinction between the two to convey like, here's what all this work leads up to, right? Like here's why we're doing this post. Like we're doing this blog post on, cold outreach because we want to be known as the best sales resource ever. I don't know, whatever it is. So creating those two distinctions, and then also including, what I like to include is things I don't like, right? So like including things like, here's a bad example of what this would look like, or here's what I don't want to happen, or it shouldn't look like this, it shouldn't read like this. I think it's a little bit more helpful for that freelancer or that vendor to understand like, what should I stay away from? Like, what will you hate? I won't do that.
We had an interesting conversation in the community about this the other day, but it actually was catalyzed by this conversation about how much should you pay freelancers? Like, what do you expect to pay a freelancer who's going to write a piece for you or your business? And the conversation took a turn that I didn't necessarily expect. And people were basically saying, well, the amount you pay depends on how much work you have to do to make them successful, right? So if you have to write an incredibly detailed brief and you have to edit the piece later, like, you shouldn't have to pay that much for it, versus if you're hiring someone who's like, has really deep subject matter expertise, maybe you're actually just paying them to just go do what they think is best. I feel like one of the things we do at Superpath is we run a marketplace. And so I've thought about briefs in that context, because we pair companies with writers and we make sure there's a brief in place. We've tried a few different things. What actually works best though is videos. Like, if we just say to the person who wants the article written, like, just record yourself talking on Loom for like 2 or 3 minutes about this article, that is so much more helpful than a document that has like the H2s already written and tells you like, okay, here's an H2, then 100 words, make sure you use this keyword. Here's the next H2. Okay, this section should have 3 bullet points. That, I think for the writer, they're just like a robot at that point, like filling in the gaps from the SEO tool that probably generated that brief in the first place. So I think that there's probably there probably is a right structure and a right template for creating a brief that works very repeatably. But this little like Loom we found to just be like so incredibly helpful. The other thing we do is every now and then with some of the marketplace customers is we jump on a call like maybe once a month, and we just ask them to just like brain dump. What are you thinking about? Okay, we got these couple ideas like in the hopper, like just riff on that for a little bit. We record it, we transcribe it, and we give it to the writers. That works really well too. And those are all maybe like expanding outside the scope of like what a traditional brief looks like. But we're just finding that it works so well when you can like let people kind of brainstorm a little more freeform than being forced to like package it up in a brief.
I want to call out in the chat, Mo pointed out he likes Emily Kramer's GACC framework for briefs: goals, audience, channel, creative, unique point of view. I like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, briefs, there can be an art to a brief, right? Where it's like you need to make sure that you provide enough direction, because people, it might sound nice, playing and just on a blank sheet of paper, but you kind of want a box to work with but then giving the writer, the creative, the space to be creative and kind of interpret that brief and deliver that back. One last question, as we're kind of we're in Q4 now, we're heading into 2023. What are some perhaps like underpriced or overlooked opportunities that you see for 2023 and some places that content marketers should be paying attention to?
Maybe I'll point to a tactic that I feel like is a sort of underrated tactic in content and events. And it's really just getting more out of your content by having things like webinars interact with your blog posts and vice versa. Because one way I think about it is, I feel like people would normally say like, oh yeah, when you do a blog post, like it should become a webinar, or a webinar becomes a blog post, right? I think what's ideal is if you can kind of test or stress test an idea, like a point of view or something, in a webinar where you have the idea partly fleshed out, and then kind of use that feedback that you get in the webinar to, refine or harden your ideas. And then after that, create an amazing blog post. I feel like that's a really good tactic for getting more out of your content and producing higher quality content. The other thing is, I feel like people think that your webinar, right, where you're presenting in front of like 50 people and you have your slides, like your ideas need to be perfect then, and you have to have like the perfect slides and have it all be a lovely presentation. But I actually think your idea should be like 90% done at that point, because I think what you actually want is you want some feedback. Like you want people to like respond in the chat or ask questions or be like, oh, that doesn't make sense, I don't get it. And then using that feedback and making your ideas better so that you can then write a stronger blog post, which then becomes the source of truth for whatever the idea is, because over time it's your blog post that people are going to keep going back to, right? No one thinks about a webinar, months from now and tries to Google the webinar, right? Usually you look for the blog post.
I love that. I feel like there's been a lot of conversation again in our community. I know I keep referencing that. There's just like a lot happening, so it's always top of mind. But a lot of stuff, a lot of conversations about kind of like down economy, like what's going on right now. There's not a lot of open content marketing roles out there right now. Like interestingly, we saw the monthly listings on our job board are down like 75% from the spring. So it's an amazing time to hire a content marketer. Like the people who are posting jobs are getting amazing candidates because there's not that many roles out there. So that's one thing. Like if you want to make a longer term investment, it's a wonderful time to hire. And I think the other thing is like I've heard a number of companies recently say like they're not sure, like they're kind of shrinking their monthly budget on content, or they're going to wait and see what happens in a month or two before they decide they're going to do whatever. So if that's you, like it's a really nice time to kind of clean up bloat. There's a lot of low hanging fruit in terms of just like general content hygiene. Like, are you doing too much? A lot of teams are doing too much. So like, can you scale back and focus on the things that really matter? Can you go back and refresh content? Are there like little like technical things wrong with your site that actually would improve SEO? Like if at the moment you're resource constrained, this can be a really good use of time. Hopefully in 2023, which I know is your real question, that's not happening so much, but like immediately potentially helpful.
Great, perfect. Well, thank you very much. I know we're kind of nearing the end of the session. Where can people find you, Amanda, if they want to reach out and see what you're up to? And maybe if you want to add to that too, share any tools that you can't live without that you use as a content marketer.
Yeah, let's see. You can find me on Twitter at AmandaNat and amandanat.com. And then check out Sparktoro. We have some free tools, also have our paid tool, and our audience research newsletter. A tool that I cannot live without as a content marketer is, I don't know, I got nothing right now. Probably Notion.
There you go. Perfect. And Jimmy, where can everybody find you and reach out?
Yeah, superpath.co. If you work in content or even related to content, come hang out. It's a free community. There's about 10,000 content marketers there. We would love to have you. That's the best place. Twitter also at Jimmy_Daly. Make sure you remember the underscore because there's another person who has the handle that I want, and sometimes they respond to tweets that are accidentally tagged with that handle. And a tool I can't live without right now is called Grain. It's a tool that you can record your Zoom calls. It has a live note-taking feature, and then it does this really slick thing with transcripts where it highlights words as you go, and you can pull out snippets, kind of in the same way that Descript does. Like you can highlight a bit of text and then share out those video clips. So we use that to transcribe any calls with customers. That stuff ends up going in content briefs and sometimes even in articles. We use it for sales and a few other things, but it's really good. And it's like $18 a month or something.
Cool. Great. Well,
okay, if I were running a blog, an SEO blog, I would say ClearScope. Sorry.
No. Yeah. No, that's perfect. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. We're going to be heading right into the next session, which is on community-led growth. So I'll see you all over in the next session. Jimmy, Amanda, thank you again for joining us and sharing all of your wisdom with the audience.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Great to see you, Amanda.